And children are so brutally honest. You must get some wonderful feedback from kids.
Oh, dear Jackie French, the rest of the class loved your book, but I fell asleep. Loved Jason. Books, endless ones about Hitler's daughter. And one of the fascinating things in that is that 1 in 50 of the letters I get about Hitler's daughter says Ben is right. Now, Ben is the character who is written as, well, not quite the thug, but he's the redneck who really thinks, look, there should be more machine guns, etc., etc. And 1 in 50 will say, yes, this book would be a lot better if Heidi had a machine gun and actually just shot them all. And yeah, Ben is right, girls go around talking too much. Yes, and Anna just actually should have shut up, and we would have been better watching a DVD instead. I mean, they are completely, utterly. And one girl last week, dear Jackie French, I hope you keep writing till your hands drop off. Love, Emily. I think that was a compliment.
I think that is. I have to read you this one, Jackie, because I found this and I thought it was just so funny and gorgeous. So this is from a young girl who says, I accidentally ordered this book from the Scholastic Book magazine. I was so furious. But since I spent my money on it and I love reading, I had to read it. After reading the first couple of chapters, I was glad the magazine screwed up my order. I felt like I was right there at the bus stop. I felt like I'd known Heidi forever, and my heart felt for her. I could relate to some of the things she went through, just not on the same level. After all, my dad wasn't Adolf Hitler. I couldn't stop reading the story. I thought that was just gorgeous.
Lovely. It's. I think one of the other things, it's translated into so many cultures, and it's been fascinating. In France, for example, they couldn't use the word Hitler. It's the daughter of the dictator. In France, the reviews have talked about...
Why couldn't they use the word?
Well, I think the Holocaust is still much closer to people in France. Remember that they too had their Holocaust and their trains. All of the reviews in France talked about the courage of the publisher in publishing a book like this. And that was actually very, very interesting. For them, it's not a book in the past. I hadn't expected the book to do well in Japan. In Japan, it was chosen as the book. They had a sort of festival where mothers and sons read together all over Japan, and they read the same book, and then they discuss it all over Japan, and they chose Hitler's daughter for that. And again, I realised that for Japan, again, it is a safe way of discussing our responsibility for the past without talking about our own history. But when you talk about it with kids, every time you turn on the news, there are genocides somewhere on the planet. Genocide has not vanished, in fact, even larger ones than happened at that time. It's not new. Next year, Hitler's Daughter, the play, starts touring the USA and Canada. It's one of those books where the sales increase year by year, and every year, I think the last book I got was the Albanian translation. If you know 20 people who might like a copy of the book in Albanian, I've now got them. It's often when you write a book, for me, in fact, it was actually a very Australian book. It was written, set in the Araluen Valley. It never occurred to me that it would be a book that has travelled as much as it has.
You mentioned the Araluen Valley where you live, just outside of Canberra, and on a beautiful property. Tell us about where you write in that. Do you have a particular space where you write?
Oh, the study. Looking out on the creek and the garden and the orchard and the wombats. And as I said, look, just about all of my books are non-fiction. They're just fictionalised. They are about real incidents, they're about real historical events, they're about real wombats, very real wombats. A surprising number, even those set on other planets, are set in the Araluen Valley or in Canberra. The next one, The Girl from Snowy River, again, it's set in the Canberra area of the Snowy rather than anywhere else. Nearly all my books, not quite, because I mean one set in Greenland and a couple are set in quite different other places. But most of the books are set in this area. When you see Biscuit Creek or something like that, you know Biscuit Creek is Braidwood. And a surprising number of the characters are, yes, just this side of defamation. But, well, I gather there are many arguments of people actually wanting to be the shearers in Pete the Sheep. And Mrs. Latter in Hitler's Daughter, the one who believes, the bus driver who believes that men should be taxed more than women because
she's
most crimes are committed. Well, she in fact is a very accurate portrait of a very dear friend who has since died.
Right.
And one of the fascinating things about that...
Was she alive when the book was published?
Yes, she never recognised each other.
Oh, didn't she?
Despite the fact every word that she says in that book is verbatim from things she would say, and her attitude, particularly her driving.
Which is appalling.
She knew the book, she never recognised each other. The fascinating thing is in all the productions of Hitler's Daughter I've seen, they have dressed that character in the purple and the various clothing idiosyncrasies that my friend wore.
Wow.
They are unmistakably her.
Do you think she would have recognised herself?
On
would she
stage.
Still not have seen it? Yeah.
She never saw the play. She didn't recognise herself in the book. She loved the character in the book. That was fine. I didn't ever say that. Oh, by the way, this is you. I think she probably would have recognised herself, but I don't think she ever realised her driving was bad. So I think she would have assumed that I just added that as a bit of dramatic licence.
And I've heard that as a child you used to tell stories to your siblings in much the same way that the children do in Hitler's Daughter. Is that right?
Yes, though probably more to the kids at school or at the bus stop. It was, if the class had behaved themselves, I was allowed to tell the class a story for the last 20 minutes.
Amazing.
And,
what a great teacher.
Well, that was we had the same teacher for first and second grade. I think it got instituted somewhere in grade 2. Then it was such a tradition for the class that they convinced other teachers to follow it on for actually the next few years.
Were you always destined to be a storyteller?
Oh yes, yes. And look, yes, I told my brother's sister's stories. I remember telling the little boy next door, I was 3, the story of the shadow men. They live under your bed, and when the lights turned out, they ooze over the floor and up the wall, and they cling onto the bed till they're above you, and then they drop on you. And during the night, the shadows cover you, and they suck out your essence, until in the morning there's only a little potato crisp among the sheets. And the little boy next door had nightmares, and I was told I wasn't allowed to play with the little boy next door till I stopped telling stories. But luckily, the little boy next door moved away soon after, which is, of course, may not have been coincidence, because I never have stopped telling stories. I've always loved the story. I've always loved books, and I've always loved working with words. And the 3 things are, in fact, completely different. You can tell a story in many ways without creating a book. You can certainly create books without telling a story. And you can, in fact, even write a book without the love of words. A strongly plotted book which uses as few words as possible to get the point across. So the 3 things don't necessarily go together, but for me, they very much do.
And you've published over 140 books.
I stopped counting at 100, yes. so I read. But look, so they're very books. Some books, a lot of the books are actually just non-fiction history. Some of them are theories of pest and weed ecology. Some of them are fiction for adults. The book I'm working on now is a very large history reassessment of Australian history, and it is for adults, certainly not for children.
So what is it that drives you to keep writing?
I love the story, and whether you're creating a history or a theory of ecology, they both are stories. They are actually both collecting the data, analysing them, and creating a realistic narrative from them. A theory about the physical universe is in fact a story. The Big Bang and the Higgs boson are in fact stories. Stories about the physical world where you're actually trying to actually fit the parts in to make a narrative that works. So as I said, I love the story, I love the words, I love the data, I love the patterns. One of my enormous griefs is that I may possibly know somewhat about the last 14 billion years of the universe, but I won't ever know the next 14 billion years or even the next million years of humanity. And knowing I will only ever know part of the story is incredibly frustrating. I really desperately would like to know, just to finish the story, what happens next.
What do you think a grade 1 Jackie French, standing up in front of the class telling those stories, would think of the adult Jackie French who's become this best-selling author?
At some level, I knew it was going to happen. At another level, I was absolutely positive it wasn't going to happen because parents, teachers, guidance counsellors always pushed me away from writing. They always said, no one in Australia can make a living being an author, do something else when you leave school. So even though at some level, every daydream, every time I envisaged myself as an adult, it was as a writer. But in my sensible incarnation as an adolescent, as a teenager, I looked and worked towards other careers. And it was only when I was absolutely desperately broke, my marriage had broken up, I was living in a shed in the bush, a wallaby, a brown snake and a wombat for company, an old typewriter I'd found at the dump. I needed $106.44 to register the car. I had $72 in the bank. And in desperation, a friend suggested using my writing, because he knew I wrote for pleasure, to earn money. And I think in those 3 weeks I moved from being an amateur who wrote simply as an indulgent pleasure and usually in secret, hiding it from everyone from my first husband through to actually most friends and parents and what have you, as a complete waste of time when you could be doing something useful. It was just a very, very private, guilty indulgence. I turned from an amateur to a professional, knowing I had to make these as good as possible. Within the 3 weeks, the story had been accepted by Angus and Robertson. They were picked out of the pile because it was the messiest, worst spelt manuscript they'd ever seen. A shriek of laughter, waving. They read it aloud in the middle of the office because they thought it would be unintentionally hilarious, and then read the entire thing.
So in that case, being badly presented and misspelled was actually, because I always tell you, make sure that your manuscript's perfect.
No.
In that case, it went in your favour.
Oh yeah, I would never have had that first book published. And it went on to be shortlisted for a couple of major awards, and they basically said, whatever you want to write, we'll publish after that. But again, the story I'd sent to the Canberra Times, I gather was thrown into the bin. When the bin was accidentally upended, someone looked at it again, and again 3 weeks later they'd offered me a fortnightly column right on the back of the Sunday Canberra Times. And the article I'd sent on organic control of scale to a magazine called Hobby Farmer, again they'd offered me a regular column when they got it. And so within 3 weeks I was earning not a good living, but a heck of a lot better than I had been doing so far, writing. And from that 3 week period, that is how I've earned my living and my family's living, being a full-time writer. It was enormously easy making a living as a writer in Australia, even from a shed in the bush. Because of course, if the writing is good enough, it will be sold overseas. There's an endless audience for writing. It is, in fact, if the work is good enough, it is very easy. And there is this wonderful myth in Australia that you can't make a living, and that people don't. And admittedly, you probably won't actually make much money till the royalties start flowing in, even if 3 years after you've written it. But if that book is good enough, it will be sold in large numbers in many countries. And I know at least 20 authors as friends who make quite respectable livings. Authors' earnings are averaged among everyone who writes, which it's a bit like averaging, it's a bit like counting me as a musician. No one except a demented wombat has ever actually wanted to listen to me play the violin. I am not a professional, even though occasionally, many decades ago in desperation, someone might put me into actually the back of the crowd simply to actually make up the numbers and just say, just don't do the bits that you can't manage, and then averaging my income, which is basically nil, and averaging that with musicians. If you average the income of writers who write as their profession, that would probably give you some idea of what you can expect to earn as a writer. And as far as I know, no one has ever actually done that. They would average the income of people who have sold a professional story.
And then the average is a couple of $1,000s.
Yes,
so
yes. It's a bit like one person like me who would do one or two or three paid gigs ever, and then say, but that makes you a professional musician, and it doesn't.
Well, thank you so much for talking to us today,
No, my
Jackie,
pleasure.
and
My
we
pleasure.
look forward to all the more stories that you're going to write for us.
Until my hands fall off, yes.
Yes, exactly. Thank you.
My pleasure.